1299, and why we called it an Ottoman Empire, because of Osman the First, it turns out, one of about almost 40 sultans who managed this empire over 600 years. We're going to talk about why it fell apart, as Leslie suggested, but we're also going to keep in the back of our minds why it is that there's been so much sort of dancing of the elephants, empires that are ebbing and flowing through this part of the world for centuries, millennia, and there's an old African saying, when the elephants fight, it is the ants who suffer. So it may be that we're going to look at all of the peoples of these empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Austro-Hungarians, the German Empire, the French, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish. They all had empires in those days. But just keep in mind that what empires do for a living is clash with the empire next door, always sort of feeling with their way whether or not they can capture more territory, more resources, more taxable populations. So keep all of that in the back of your mind. We're going to cover a tremendous amount of territory, and if it starts to get down in the reeds too much, just start waving your hands and saying TMI, too much information. Just don't let me go down any of those rabbit holes, because all of this, to me, for some reason, it's a genetic weakness, I think. All of this is interesting to me, and let me just impart as much of it of significance to you, not just stuff that is historically, geopolitically, sociologically, religiously interesting. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of what we did last week. We'll do a quick recap, 2 weeks ago. We'll do a quick recap, and then we're going to march into that period of the last 300 years or so, when this massive empire in both Asia, all three, Asia, Africa, and Europe, starts to decline and eventually meets its final demise at the end of the First World War. So that's our mission today. Thanks for being here. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, so store those up, and we'll be able to try to clarify things that we've raced through. So the other thing you'll need to do is buckle up, because we're going to go pretty fast through some of this, and you'll want to steady yourself. Keep your hands and arms inside the cage, if you would. I was down in Central Oregon over the weekend. I gave a talk on, of all things, the Ottoman Empire. And one young man raised his hand and he said, "Why should I care?" So part of what I added about half an hour ago was one slide that I hope explains why you should care. But before we get there, at the end of our talk 2 weeks ago, I talked about why we call this bird a turkey. Yeah, a turkey, and how the early European settlers and pioneers and colonists in the Americas mistook the indigenous bird on the left, which is in fact what we call a turkey, for the guinea fowl that Europeans had gotten used to in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Well, the reason they got used to these guinea fowl coming in to grace their tables in Europe was because of guys like these. In the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I said, what we really need, because those Venetians are such upstarts, and they're really trying to corner the market on all of the goods and services that flow out of the Middle East and India and Africa and Asia into Europe, we really need to counter them by putting our own people in Istanbul and having them become the purveyors of Turkish and Asian and African and Middle Eastern goods. So these guys down here at the bottom were part of the British guys, Anglos, who were living, in some cases living as Turks in Istanbul, and it was their responsibility to sell all these goods to the European market. And they did a great deal of business with the guinea fowl up there on the right, and I have a better pointer than that one. And so the people of Europe in those days got used to seeing these, which were then called turkey hens or turkey cocks. And eventually the hen and the cock designation drops away, and the bird was simply known as turkeys. But the thing we eat, that delicious bird we eat at Thanksgiving, has a remarkable heritage, much of which came from being misidentified. Now, does misidentifying something significant ring a bell? What did Columbus discover? Yeah, and who were the people that were living there when he got there? Indians, right? And the connection between misidentification and virtually all of these empires' outreach around the world, it just goes on and on and on. Stories are unending about the number of things we got mistaken and but become a part of our vocabulary, and in our case, a part of our national traditions. So our mission today is to look at this empire and to try to figure out why it is and how it was that it shrunk down to the modern day country of Turkey. As you can see from this map, it is an extensive, almost completely hegemonic control, at least of the central and eastern part of the Mediterranean. And remember, the Mediterranean was really the superhighway, the internet, the wiki market of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, going all the way back to the Romans at the beginning of their empire. So we'll look at what we talked about, the rise and plateau of the Ottoman Empire last couple weeks ago, why it starts to stagnate and decline. Part of the reason being that the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch and the British are all, and the Russians are all rising in their capacity to control territory and trade routes. We'll look at a series of reforms called the Tanzimat, which is a Turkish word that is an exact translation of perestroika. Reorganization, re-engineering, reform. The Soviet Union survived 6 years after perestroika started in 1985 under Gorbachev. The Ottoman Empire lasts longer than that, but the reforms led in a similar way to their dissolution as an empire. When you have so much to talk about and 6 centuries of significant historical events, I think it's important also to do a history of hats. So we'll go to that just in the middle, probably. Nationalism is one of the key components to why the Ottoman Empire, and in fact every empire, over time has dissolved. Because those little provinces that are way out there, that province of Angultura, where the Romans had this little outpost in the British Isles, that province eventually develops a sense of being its own polity, its own political unit, its own nation, and they start to push against the empire. The same thing has happened since time began. Can't really talk about the development at the end of the Ottoman Empire and its birth into the country of Turkey without talking about the Armenian genocide. It has gotten much less focus and attention than it deserves. as one of the most horrific events of the 20th century. And as you all know, President Biden, about 3 weeks ago, was the first U.S. president to ever acknowledge that a genocide was committed at the end of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, and we're going to talk about it just to give you a better sense of what happened. World War I is the war to end all wars, but it certainly didn't. And it was also the beginning of the end for several empires. We'll talk in specific terms about that. Why it is that the rise and fall of the Ottomans is important. Your good questions, and then, as befits a talk about a caliphate, we should have a benediction. So watch for that. You'll be surprised who wrote the benediction when we get to it. So these are the slides I inserted this morning after my talk down in Bend, Oregon, when the young man asked, why, well, who cares? Why should I care about this? And this was the slide I put in here. Does anybody recognize who that person is at the podium? Is that you? No. It's Slobodan Milosevic, who was the president of Serbia, who celebrated 1989 as the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. Battle of Kosovo was when the Ottoman Empire takes Kosovo from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And 600 years later, Slobodan Milosevic uses it as a kind of emotional foundation of his efforts to ethnically cleanse Kosovo, Bosnia, Herzegovina in the 1990s. So here is a battle 600 years before that is still mobilizing and motivating people to commit atrocities in the 20th century. Why were they so successful in the early centuries of the Ottoman Empire? Lots of reasons. They continued to expand. That, as again, a part of the imperial playbook, you have to keep growing in order to keep healthy, sort of like a shark that has to keep moving in order to process oxygen. They were able to do it also because they controlled trade routes in places like the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and eventually the Persian Gulf, and as we'll see a little bit later, also the Indian Ocean. And they were able to control that very significant trade between India and Europe, much of which was spices coming from one end and cloth in large measure going in the other direction. They developed a centralized taxation system that was really efficient. Other empires had tried different methods of tax collection. Nobody liked the tax man. The Beatles even wrote a song about the tax man. Nobody likes the tax man, but that somehow or another the Ottomans were able to make their system uniform and fair. And that if you were the pasha of a local community or a poor farmer, you had a predictable and perceived to be fair allocation that you had to pay into the tax system, long before its time. The Ottomans also had a reputation for being ruthless. They would go into communities and either take them by siege or starve them to death or get them to capitulate in some way. But once they did do that, they were also able to absorb them into this system that had a great deal of tolerance. You remember the millet system that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, they were able to codify their laws, again, like the tax system, so that they were uniform across all of the regions of the empire. something that many empires had never even attempted, let alone accomplished. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons why Suleiman the Magnificent was so magnificent was that he required that those laws be in harmony with Islamic law and also with Christian canon. So he recognized that his empire was made up in those days of primarily Greek Orthodox faithful. Suleiman the Magnificent was also very savvy in his foreign diplomacy. One of the things we didn't mention 2 weeks ago was his moral support and his financial support for a guy named Martin Luther. The Ottomans actually funneled money to the Reformation leaders and revolutionaries as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, and they did so largely to weaken the Holy Roman Empire, weaken the papacy, weaken the Catholic dominance by supporting these Lutherans, these Calvinists, these, Huguenots. There you go. They provided for all of you who have been to Turkey and to Istanbul today, you've seen the fruits of the collection of all of these resources from the empire, and they plowed them into art, architecture, poetry, music, and the development of a kind of a culture that could be called Turkish. Gunpowder, as we talked about, was also a big component of this. They were early adopters of that formula that would allow them to blow other people up, a development from China in the 9th century that we haven't yet put back in the box, though it would be great if we could. And then, I may not have put as fine a point on this as I should have in part 1, but they managed through their peculiar, to my mind, succession system of always ending up with a really capable sultan. In fact, the first 10 sultans did nothing but expand the empire and were more or less, in fact, in some cases, fabulously more successful even than their predecessors. So they had figured out how to let the cream rise to the top of the leadership in Topkapi Palace, the center of the government, in ways that I think many of us would be envious of. Although, as I was explaining this to my wife the other day, she looked at me and said, "Thank heavens our presidents have all been of uniform high quality." One book I didn't put on your reading list I'd like to recommend. I'll send around a reminder of this. Orhan Pamuk is a Turkish writer who won the Nobel Prize in 2006, I think, and has written a book about exactly this high point in the Ottoman Empire. And it's called My Name is Red, and it is a very interesting, compelling read, but really does a good job of illuminating this unique culture that the Ottomans developed as they reached the top of the development of their empire. Orhan Pamuk was also accused and convicted of affronting Turkishness, was his crime, when he mentioned the Armenian genocide. He was later convicted, but then pardoned. So we talked about this in part 1, too. We start here at the very end of the 13th century and then move in rapid succession through a whole bunch of different sultans up to a point where the empire starts to stop. The empire loses its accelerative ability to continue on. The rest of the sultans, oddly, are pretty much duds. They don't have the vision, they don't have the organizing capability. In some cases, they didn't have the military prowess to be able to continue to expand the empire. So it's really an interesting and maybe oft-told story of empire, that they get to a point where they're so good that they can't keep it up. Happened to Alexander the Great, happened to Julius Caesar, happened to Catherine the Great. This is why I'm here today. Sea lanes had a lot to do with it. But somebody asked last week, 2 weeks ago, why the Ottomans, since they were such a great power and they controlled the sea lanes all around them, why didn't they venture out across the Atlantic and do as the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, and the English had done, which was go and try to not only discover the Americas, but also exploit their resources so that their empires could grow. And it's really a function of geography. If you're over here, and you want to go way over here, the only really good way to do it is to go right out the mouth of the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and then across the Atlantic Ocean. They couldn't get out. The Spanish and the Portuguese are controlling all of this territory and simply blowing them up when an Ottoman ship would try to leave the Mediterranean. As I mentioned, the Ottomans had pretty good control within that sea, but the only alternative to that, going out through the mouth of the Mediterranean, was to go all the way down under the continent of Africa and then to the Americas. They didn't do it not only because of resistance from the Portuguese and the Spanish, but also because these trade routes to India that they did control were so lucrative. They were getting untold wealth passing through their hands, which they often sold to the Venetians or later through the Levant Company to the Europeans, and they were making out like bandits, making out like pirates. And so they had largely a kind of a monopoly on all of these goods that people were really desperate for. Cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, cayenne, all those things that the Europeans were desperate for because their food didn't taste very good until the empire allowed them to bring in all this marvelous spice. Spice was almost the oil, almost the petroleum of empire. It was an amazing lure for people to go out and conquer the Spice Islands, for instance. But they get to a point where the empire stops growing. And the primary reasons for that are the two empires on either side of them. The Austro-Hungarians on this side and the Persians on this side. They're squeezed between relatively powerful and long-standing. In the case of the Persians had been an empire since the 5th century before the Common Era, when Cyrus the Great ran things in that neighborhood. And the Ottomans couldn't break through in this direction, and as we all know, they tried and tried and tried and tried for hundreds of years to continue to expand into Western Europe, and never could get past the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they're boxed in by 1700, 1710, and then they're almost bystanders as these other empires that have been so successful at expansion and capturing resources have grown and grown and grown, not only in their wealth, but also in their military power. And so the Ottomans start to lose battles, which they really hadn't done until about 1700. But one piece after another of their empire starts to either breakaway of its own action and volition and effort, or get taken away by some other empire. You can see from this map, it probably could be the only slide I showed that we could talk about for several hours, because it shows you how the empire that we talked about in part one grew from that nugget, and now how it gets shrunken down to its now current state of Turkey here on the Anatolian Peninsula. But if you look at this carefully, you can see how different dates are so significant. One of the most significant is when Greece breaks away from the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s. And why and how they were successful is the stuff of a legend, but also a whole talk in and of itself. They were really not the canary in the coal mine, they were the canary who escapes the coal mine with his breath intact. And lots of other parts of the empire say, well, wait a minute, why are those Orthodox Greeks getting to have their own country, not pay the overlord in Istanbul their taxes? Why are they getting their own king? Why are they getting control of their own territory? And that nugget of a kind of a self-determination and freedom is what starts to ripple through the empire. As I mentioned, some of those parts of the empire broke away of their own action, with their own action, but others are simply swallowed up by other empires. Catherine the Great had this notion that Russia should control everything, and she pretty much created the Russia that we know of today. It created what was the Soviet Union and is today the Federated Republic of Russia, all the way from the Pacific to the Black Sea. In a political cartoon of the era, you can see what the Turks thought of Russia. Russia, the octopus, reaching down on poor Turkey, that is valiantly trying to defend the Anatolian Peninsula, but having to deal with this monstrous leviathan of an empire that is pulling apart parts of their empire. So the Albanians and the Montenegrins and the Serbians and the Bulgarians get this idea too, and they say, well, wait a minute, why don't we also break away? We're not Turks. Many of us aren't Muslim. Let's break away and have our own nation. It was the time when individual provinces of empires were starting to dream of nationhood. And what started that idea, political scientists suggest, is this thing called the Peace or the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648, where all the countries of Europe that have been fighting each other to death for centuries got together and said, you know, this is ridiculous, we can't and unsustainable, we have to sue for peace. And by the way, why don't we make these boundaries between us sacrosanct? Why don't we recognize each other's territory? And that was really for the first time in 1648 that notion of sovereignty of a territory that wasn't somebody else's empire became more and more popular in countries and nations and people around the world. As I mentioned, the Greek Wars of Independence in the 1820s accelerated that. And the Tanzimat reforms, the perestroika of the era, was trying to figure out that Ottoman sultans were saying, well, wait a minute, the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch are doing so well, why aren't we doing better? And so they tried to become more and more European. And as a result, they brought in not only ideas about a better way to organize the economy, a better way to organize a society, but they also brought in those radical ideas like Albania for the Albanians, like independence for the Greeks. In 1848, across Europe, they sort of took 200 years for this notion to trickle down, but almost every one of the nations that we know of in Europe today was a battlefield for trying to control their own territory in the very revolutionary era of 1848. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at that point was a man named Mahmud II. And he decided that not only was he going to revolutionize every aspect of the Ottoman system, which up till then had been working pretty well, he decided that he would also revolutionize what people wore. And this is where we take a quick break. I just love hats, by the way. And the fact that here is an empire where hats can explain to you just about everything about it that an hour-long lecture could. And so let's look at these hats. As you saw in part one, the Ottoman sultans and their viziers had the planet's absolute best hats ever. They were just magnificent. Some of them were as big as Baltimore, right? They were just as magnificent as they could be, and everyone who saw the Sultan or the Grand Vizier knew that these were important people. In the Tanzimat reforms, they decided maybe they'd better scale these back a little bit, and for a while they tried this sort of goofy, not ill-fitting stocking cap, and then people said, well, that's no good. Why don't we do the fez? And so for many of you who think about the Ottoman Empire and Turks and even the Shriners of today, we could talk about the Shriners, you think of the fez. Well, the fez was absolutely foreign to the Turks. The fez came from Morocco, right? That somebody in His Majesty's sphere of influence had said, well, if we really want to look modern, you ought to see what those people in North Africa are wearing today. And so, by fiat, the Sultan said, no more fancy headdress, we're all going to wear a fez. And by fiat, all the men did, both in business, in education, in the military, and so did His Majesty as well. And so, overnight, the fez is introduced into the Ottoman Empire. We're going to talk about Mustafa Kemal, who is given the honorific name Ataturk. But guess what? He wore a sort of a modified version of the fez made from Karakul wool from Central Asia. But he too said, wait a minute, we can't be wearing fezes all around. People will think we're sort of backward members of some ill-gotten empire. So we're going to go another step and wear British hats only. And so Ataturk, by fiat, makes illegal, prohibits the wearing of the fez. And says, look, men, you have to wear the trilby, the bowler, the top hat. And in the 1920s, by law, he prohibited the wearing of the fez and the wearing of veils for women. Ataturk was an autocrat as deep into his soul as is possible to look, but he had some modernizing ideas. In a secular society, we really should look like this. So you're getting the notion, I hope, that the Ottomans are hugely successful, and then the Europeans rise up in terms of their own powers and abilities, and then the Ottomans start to mimic the Europeans, but don't do it very well, and lose control of all of those provinces. We'll get back to Ataturk in a bit. Parts of the decline that are so significant include Catherine the Great's battle in 1774. Over 200 years, the Turks fought almost 20 battles, wars, with the Russians, and lost 19 of them. So you can just imagine that octopus coming lower and lower and lower and lower and carving away more of the Ottomans' territory. They even lost to Napoleon in 1798 when he took, briefly, when he took over Cairo and Egypt. As I mentioned, the bleeding continues as they lose the Greek peninsula. The reforms take place in the 1830s and beyond, and then the Ottomans have a victory against Russia, the one that they won, but they didn't win it on their own. As you'll remember, maybe not all of us, but I remember the Crimean War as being a major effort by the British and the French and the Ottomans to push back the growing Russian Empire. One of the ideas that they import from the Europeans is, hey, let's have a constitution, limit the power of the Sultan, and have more, not only elections, but also more say in public policy. Does anybody know how long this constitution was in force?
2 years.
2 years, that's right, until the Sultan takes it and tears it up in 1878. Years go by, resentment is bubbling up from underneath, and along comes a group of very well-trained military officers who start out in the Ottoman elite schools, and they're trained to become kind of like the Janissaries were that we talked about in part 1, but they're the new cream of the crop of the military. But they too have been infected by these new European notions, and they decide that the Sultan is no longer the right way to run things, that in fact it should be run by us, the 3 pashas. The bleeding continues when Italy decides that it too wants to get into the great game, and they invade and capture Libya. The Balkans are now starting to gain independence, in many cases still part of the Ottoman Empire, but clearly controlled either locally or by the Russians. And then at the end of the story for the Ottomans, the First World War is what puts the nail in the coffin. One of the important questions to ask about the First World War is the Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Bulgaria, were in league, and the Ottoman Empire, under the 3 pashas, said, why don't we join the Central Powers instead of the allies, Britain, France, and Russia, later the United States, because we think the Germans, have a much better organizational approach to government. We think that the Germans are not a threat to the Ottoman Empire, unlike the British and the French, who've always been trying to carve it up and take off bits of it. And so they ally themselves with the Germans. Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1900 visits Istanbul, and as a gift to the great Ottoman Empire, he says, well, why don't we build this railway? We're going to build it from Berlin up here all the way to Baghdad down here, and it's going to allow you, the Ottomans, to have this wonderful entree into the markets of Europe, and it's going to allow us, the Germans, a wonderful entree into the oil fields of Mesopotamia. Pretty soon, oil replaces spices as the reason that people build empires or try to. The other interesting aspect of this was that the Germans, in making this contract for this Berlin to Baghdad railway, also built into the contract that they would have mineral rights for 30 kilometers on either side of the rail lines. And as often as they could, they ran the railroad through oil fields. These were the four leaders of the Central Powers. Caption below says, Vereinte Kräfte führen zum Ziel. United powers will lead us to the goal. Together we can create this new magical environment where the British, the French, and the Russians are minor players. As we get closer to living memory, the trench warfare in World War I was a horrifying butchery of humanity that is impossible to even imagine. The United States, as you know, gets involved in the First World War in 1917, so quite a few, 2.5 years after it began in Europe in August of 1914. And Woodrow Wilson had some really good ideas about what it was that this war should try to accomplish if and when it is ever done. You know, the war to make the world safe for democracy was one of his lines. We're going to look at some other of his important input in a little bit. But while the Americans were talking about self-determination, I think in a meaningful, purposeful, genuine way, the British were employing this notion of self-determination to try to pick off parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so the first group that the British tried to talk into breaking away from the Ottomans are the Arabs down in Mecca and Medina. And so they try to create a rebellion against the Ottomans, the Turks, by the Arabs down in Arabia. And Sir Henry McMahon, who's running Egypt at this point, says to Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, he says, look, if you fight against the Turks, you can have all the territory you liberate. He didn't mean it. Along come a British diplomat and a French officer, Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, and what they're doing is carving up the Ottoman Empire, even at the same time that the Foreign Office is promising parts of it to different groups of people. So Sykes and Picot look at the Eastern Mediterranean and say, okay, well, let's see. The French say, well, we'll take this part, and we'll take this juicy bits here, and you British can have this part, and you can even control Mesopotamia down here. And so they, even while the Foreign Office is saying to the Arabs, you can have it, the French and the British are saying, we're going to take it all. And we're going to take it all to promote and cement our imperial presence. But that wasn't all. If this isn't John Cleese's great-grandfather, I don't know what has happened in Britain over the last 100 years. But along comes Lord Balfour, who is the foreign minister of the British Empire, and he says to the Jewish communities of Europe and Palestine, well, we, the British government, His Majesty's government, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. He's promising the Jewish people the territories in Palestine that Henry McMahon just promised the Arab peoples if they would liberate it. Okay? Keep that in mind. Decades later, the Foreign Secretary in Britain says this about that period of time. He said, a lot of the problems we are having to deal with now, I have to deal with now, are a consequence of our colonial past. The Balfour Declaration and the contradictory assurances that were being given to the Palestinians in private at the same time that they were being given to the Israelis, again, an interesting history for us, but not an honorable one. To top this off, the British are offering the Tsarist regime, still in Russia, still in power, that if they stay in the war, because they've got some huge problems at home, as the Bolsheviks will tell you, if you stay in the war, the British said, we'll give you Istanbul. They didn't mean it. They were never going to give Russia a warm water port, access out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. But they dangled it before the Tsar in order to get the Russians to stay in the war. So the British come through this period looking like fast manipulators of everything, but most significantly, the truth. So, how did this turn into this, and then this? How did the Ottoman Empire in its glory days become a small peninsula of Turkish peoples? Bless you. Well, as I said, the other empires were always trying to pull it apart. And this wonderful political cartoon from the era, you have the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians deciding that they really want Bosnia and Herzegovina and that part of the Balkans, and bless you, and Bulgaria, because those are Slavs and those are Eastern Orthodox Christians, and the Ottomans are standing by on the Turkish peninsula and watching their empire pulled apart by these other empires. The three pashas that I mentioned earlier in brief are these three guys. Jamal Pasha, Pasha simply means leader, lord, honorary, Talat Pasha, and most significantly, Enver Pasha. And it was these three guys that pretty much determined Ottoman policies all the way up until the end of their lives. Two of them died by assassination, one by a bullet from the Russian, then now Soviet, army in Central Asia. These three guys did something that was uniquely antithetical to the earlier way that the Ottomans treated their minority groups. And they had, as I mentioned, allowed different groups of people to maintain their religious faith, their way of doing trade, business within their communities, their marriage laws, their family laws, their property rights within their communities, that millet system we talked about. One of the maybe unintended consequences of the millet system was it made all of these communities identifiable. And for one of them in particular, the Armenian community, they were allowed to be the Christians that they were, allowed to be in their traditional homeland, which they'd been in for 2,000 or 3,000 years, allowed to operate until those three pashas decided that they were a threat to the state. The reason they thought they were a threat to the state is that the Ottomans decide that the Russian Empire is in the way of expanding to the north and east and capturing some of those traditionally Turkic areas in Central Asia, today that we call Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan is Persian, and there's one more and I never remember it. Kazakhstan, did I say? Anyway, the Stans, and the Russians were in the way, but the three pashas decide that they're going to invade Russia during World War, just before World War I begins, and the Armenians, as you'll see, are right here in their traditional homeland. Well, not only are some of the Armenians already in the Russian army, because the Russian army conscripted everybody, but there are also some Armenians who say, hey, wait a minute, why don't we fight against these Turks, these three pashas, who are so resistant to us having our own way of life, in contradiction to the Ottoman tradition, and they join in with the Russian army and fight against their own nation. And it was that bit of what the three pashas decided was treachery that caused the three pashas then to turn on the Armenian people in 1915. And after this battle at Sarıkamış, they decide that they're going to force march almost all of the 2 million Armenians out of their traditional territory. One of the first examples of ethnic cleansing that the world has seen on this scale. That over the course of 8 years, as many as 1.5 million Armenians were killed in this process. Most of them starved to death as they're being marched off into the deserts of Syria and Iraq to get away from the Russian border. And as I mentioned, it has taken the international community quite a few years to acknowledge that this in fact took place as the policy of the Ottoman government. At the time, it was no secret. The world knew this was happening. Quickly, 1914 is a brutal year. It's hard maybe for you to see these casualty numbers on the right-hand side, but if you look at them long enough, in the course of 1 year, these nations were losing this many of their soldiers and sailors to either death or injury in the First World War. In that first year, when it becomes such an awful, terrible stalemate, particularly on the Western Front, in France and Belgium, the French in that first year lost 950,000 killed or wounded, and the total number of square mileage that they gained in the course of that 1 year from the Germans was one square mile of territory changed effective hands with this much of a casualty rate. First World War was the first modern war, the first world war. It was a war, again, to end all wars, but it certainly didn't. It introduced many of the things that we've come to know as parts of our war efforts. The first time when trucks and cars were used to get troops to the front lines. Warships became oil-powered rather than coal-fired. Long-range submarines came into play. Airships, airplanes, aerial surveillance, poison gas became a weapon of war used by all sides in World War I. Tanks became the way that you could get across those trenches in Flanders and get across to the other side. And importantly, because the war didn't end in 1914, it was going to be that society, that economy that survived the longest that was going to be the victor. And that convinced all of the warring parties that they should start dealing with society, economies, industries as legitimate targets of war. And this was the first world war in the sense that every aspect of all of these warring societies was involved in the war effort, not just the soldiers. Several luminaries come up in this story. Winston Churchill is certainly the one whose name resonates with all of us. He had an idea that because there was this stalemate on the Western Front and the Eastern Front up in the north between Russia and Germany and Austro-Hungarian forces, that what we ought to do really is go around to the soft underbelly of the Central Powers and invade through Istanbul up into the Black Sea, and that way we'll be able to support the Russian war effort in the Crimea. Well, as we all know from our own history books, the British and the French tried to get through this narrow strait, the Dardanelles here, and the Battle of Gallipoli ensued, where tens of thousands of both Allied troops and Ottoman troops died over the course of about 15 months. It was a complete and utter disaster for the British and the French. They got stuck in the straits. They couldn't make any progress because of the batteries on either side. And so they decided that they would have, instead of withdrawing their troops and going home and rethinking the strategy, they doubled down. They had a lot of sunk cost by that point, and they authorized a land invasion, almost entirely made up of Australians and New Zealanders, the ANZAC group, the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. And it was those troops that tried then to fight their way up the Gallipoli Peninsula so that they could allow then those ships to get through to take Istanbul and to open the straits up to Russia. Hard to imagine the carnage and the hopelessness and the poor planning and the hubris of this effort. And when it was acknowledged that it was a tremendous failure, Churchill is forced to resign. And what he does, instead of going back to his lordly estate, he joins the army. He goes to the Western Front. He does a very honorable thing, even though he thought his political career was over because of his advocacy for the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. You'll see Churchill again, as we all know. The other thing the British thought they would do is go and secure the oil fields, but from the underside, because they were having a really hard time getting there from the north. And so they authorized a British occupation of first Basra at the mouth of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then a place called Kut, about halfway to Baghdad. On their way to capturing Baghdad, they were going to secure all those oil fields. Again, they underestimated the power and the organization of the Ottoman fighting force, again through a kind of imperial superiority complex, and the British didn't get there. They couldn't get past Kut. They weren't fighting with mostly Englishmen and Irishmen and Scotsmen and Welsh and Cornish. They were fighting mostly with Indians and Hindu, both Hindu and Muslim members of their empire. But they get up to Kut, and at this point, the British can go no further. The Ottomans have surrounded their troops, and the British surrender 13,000 men to the Ottomans in 1916. Probably the largest, they think, the largest surrender of British forces ever. Again, the Ottomans aren't going quietly. They're fighting for their lives, they're fighting for their empire against these foreign invaders. The British send Lawrence of Arabia to Kut to try to buy the 13,000 from the Ottomans, and they offered them £2 million sterling, which was a lot of money, if they would let the 13,000 go. And the Ottoman Pasha said no. The war ends. We're going to motor quickly. The French and the British, as I said, had already designs on all of the territory of the Ottoman Empire, and they started to carve it up. When you can, read a history of the relationship between these two guys. It is fascinating to see how they, who were in charge of the Allied efforts, the British and French efforts at the end of the First World War, how poorly they got along with each other. And even though they had to cooperate to carve up the empire, at one point at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, David Lloyd George turns to Georges Clemenceau and says, he challenged him to a duel. Let's go out to the parking lot and settle this like real men. Another important component of that peace conference, of course, were the Arabs, who were represented by Prince Faisal from Mecca, and that's Lawrence of Arabia right there. Prince Faisal was humiliated at this conference because all of those promises that Henry McMahon had made to them turned out to be not worth the paper they were written on. Woodrow Wilson gets involved in the conference in a meaningful way, but then the United States withdraws in the 1920s, leaving the British and the French pretty much to do what they want with the spoils of war. The First World War was clearly the nail in the coffin. Even though the Ottomans had victories here and there, the Armenian genocide became known to the world. Sykes and Picot create their plan to carve up the Ottoman Empire. The British promise part of all of Palestine to the Israelis, the future Israelis, the Jewish movement in Europe, while also offering the Arabs the same territory. 1922, the Sultanate of the Ottoman Empire is abolished. Mustafa Ataturk takes control and declares a republic and abolishes the caliphate. Interestingly, Ataturk, whose name means, honorific means father of the Turk, Mustafa Kemal was offered the title of Sultan by the parliament and offered the title of Caliph by the parliament and declined them both and then abolished them both. And he said, no, we are a republic. That wave of nationalism that I talked about that helped mobilize and motivate people to seek their own national status, their own self-determination, was something that Kemal Ataturk was a master at mobilizing within the Turkish community. And so instead of saying the empire has to continue, he was saying, let's create a modern Turkish state. He started in Ankara because that was the only part of the Anatolian Peninsula at the end of the First World War that wasn't occupied. And from there, he did what Osman I did, gradually expand and expand and expand as much as he could until he controlled the whole of the peninsula. With the fall of the Balkan territories before the war, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire after the war, a lot of the Greeks and Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox members of the empire were suddenly persona non grata in the Anatolian Peninsula, and they start to migrate into the Balkan territories. At the same time, a lot of the Muslims in the Balkans discovered that they're persona non grata, and they migrate into Turkey. As many as 2 million people are crossing between the former republics in Southeast Europe onto the Anatolian Peninsula. What some people have called the Great Sorting, leaving pretty much Greece, mostly Greek, and Turkey, mostly Turkish, by 1925. But there was a tremendous loss of life at the same time. Ataturk, as I said, was an autocrat and essentially a dictator. And he said, okay, now that Arabic alphabet we've been using since time began, that's gone. You are now going to use the Latin alphabet. And so at the stroke of a pen, he made every one of his people illiterate. Declares the Republic in 23, outlaws the fez and the veil, as I said. This is the one I like best. In the 1920s, just a couple of years after the women in the United States earned the right to vote in national elections, he granted women the right to vote. And that's really significant, but it was the right to vote for him. This too was interesting. He wanted to break down the tribal affiliations, and so everyone had to adopt a surname. Surnames were completely foreign to the Turkish people up to this point, but all of them today, when you look to see, like Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Erdogan is his surname. And it was because of Ataturk's diktat that every Turk needed to have a surname. Again, you'll notice a pattern here. He's starting to do things that are sort of European to become a more effective state. He also angers the ulama, the religious scholars, throughout what used to be the caliphate, for goodness sake. They used to control Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, and all of a sudden he's saying, religion has no business being a part of this new modern state. And so there was, at that point, by fiat, no more Islam as a part of the code of law in Turkey. The person who is bringing it back into codified law in Turkey is Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his AKP party. Probably the most significant move in terms of public policy was, while he was doing all of these reforms, he also turned to the military and said, and if we ever stray from these constitutional reforms, I want you, the military, to enforce our getting back in line. And so, as you probably know, there have been 6 coups d'etat in Turkey since the 1920s. And it's always the military trying to step in if one group or another is putting the Constitution in jeopardy. I'm sure this will continue to work. Ataturk has got to be one of the most significant figures in the 20th century. So I encourage you, if you look up anything and read any good biography of him, you'll find a wealth of information about this man, this Ottoman, born in Thessaloniki of all places, blonde-haired, blue-eyed of all things, who becomes the father of the Turk. So, in sum, to summarize all of this, one of the interesting things about the First World War and the decline of the Ottoman Empire is that when it goes down as an empire, but it takes the Germans with them. It takes the Austro-Hungarians with them. It takes the Russian Empire. In fact, almost all the land empires in that part of the world are gone, are finished. And the maritime empires are on their last legs. So historians generally say that World War I is what did in the land empires, and World War II is what finalized the defeat of the maritime empires. Think about that as you think about British and French history. That, you know, the more I study the Middle East, the more I see the hands and fingers of outside forces. The Russians, the British, the French, the Americans, anybody you can think of who can see some benefit to getting involved and manipulating things on the ground in the Middle East. That certainly continued at the end of the Ottoman Empire. All those borders that we saw on those 21 countries in the Middle East are now drawn by the victors, drawn by the British and the French, mostly. Sympathetic rulers are put in power in all of these places, and importantly, minority communities are privileged. The French did this all over the French Empire. They'd pick a very small group of people and say, okay, now you're going to get the best training, the best jobs, the best education, the best food, the best access to power, you, your little minority group, and you're going to help us rule all the rest of them. And no better description of the Alawites in Syria exists. So Bashar al-Assad, who is running Syria now, so into the ground, is exactly one of those members of a very small religious minority, the Alawites, whom the French privileged and have been in power ever since the French left. They did this all over the empire. The Belgians did it all over the world. The British did it all over the world. One of the hallmarks of the collapse of the empire is that as all these new modern states are being set up, the people who live there, the ants in that fight of the elephants, they're never consulted. What kind of government do you want? What kind of borders do you want? What kind of political or economic system do you want? What kind of government do you want? They're never consulted. It's always imposed from the top, the outside top down. Militaries are given special privileges and lots of power. People, the ants, don't like it very much, and over the course of time start to rebel. To my mind, one of the reasons that the Middle East is so dysfunctional a region is that they were never given this ability to develop on their own, never given the opportunity to establish their own legitimacy. We talked about Ataturk and his modernizations. We talked about the forced migrations, including the Armenian genocide, that may have been an antecedent of some of the other ethnic cleansing genocides of the 20th century. So that grand empire became all of these constituent states after the First World War, and that leads us to you. What kinds of questions does any of that bring to mind?
And before we get there, because I know some of you have to eat, can we have a warm round of applause for David Fenner? And he'll take your questions. So who has a question?
Charles has one right here.
Okay, even before Charles, I have one. Who took over Constantinople after the First World War? Which country took that particular city?
The Turks, after they became a republic in 1923, they had managed to expand from Ankara in the center of the country and included the traditional territories in Istanbul, both on the Asian side and on the European side. So today, they control that territory. They had to wrest it from occupying forces. Charles.
What do you see as the future of Syria?
Let me moisten up here a little bit. Syria is the victim of that process of how it became a state that I just mentioned, with Alawites being the privileged party. They also are the locus of civil war, a Cold War, a Holy War, and I was going to say a race war. That might be too much. But they are trapped in a territory that is instability personified, exemplified, and that there is the only way that the Syrian government has been able to control it since independence in the 1940s was through strong-armed, strong-hand military tactics. And so there, it's, if I thought you were going to ask that question, I would have brought my pressure cooker. You know, you put the top on it, and you put the artichokes in it, and you put a little water in, and it's the pressure cooker inside there. So I'm not entirely optimistic about what's going to happen in Syria over the next. But at some point, Bashar al-Assad, it has to go. But he's managed to survive 10 years of a civil war, a proxy war, a Cold War, and a religious war. So I don't know what's going to eventually push him out the door. The Russians came to his aid, as we all know, and helped him to maintain power. Don't know the answer to that. But it's a classic example of how one of those pieces of the Ottoman Empire wasn't allowed to develop in what we might call a natural or an organic way.
Why did the U.S. pull out of the Paris 1919 talks? I can't remember that.
The problem with the Paris peace talks and the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations that grew out of that Paris process was that Wilson brought it home and asked the Senate to ratify the treaty, and the Senate said, we're not going to ratify this. We're not going to play ball with you. And it was domestic U.S. politics that tied Woodrow Wilson's hands. Also, Woodrow Wilson is a lot less physically able and maybe mentally able by 1919 to push very hard against Congress. But when they didn't authorize the treaty, when they didn't ratify the treaty or authorize the joining of the League of Nations, it was pretty much the end of U.S. involvement in that entire part of the world. But you'll see in just a second, when we get to our benediction, that I'm going to come back to that question.
And maybe we should get to the benediction.
Because I know you're all hungry. You've been very patient. The benediction, don't go before the benediction. One last thing. I know Leslie has sent you that reading list, all good. Here are 2 books on Afghanistan I thought you might want to look at, so come up afterwards. There are some really good books, including Steve Call's book, Ghost Wars on Afghanistan. So while these have nothing to do with today's talk, Afghanistan was never in the Ottoman Empire, I think we